One of the big beliefs decades ago, when 401ks were really coming to life, was that you were going to be in a lower tax bracket when you retired. But is that going to be true? I'm James Studinger, financial planner and author of the book Wealth is a Choice. I do believe that wealth is a choice and that we get wealthier by buying things that make us more money. Back in the 1990s, many people were in the 28% tax bracket, and they were told to put their money into a pre-tax 401k and reap the tax benefits immediately. Then, when they retire, they'll be in a lower tax bracket, and they can pull out those withdrawals and pay less in taxes. Well, if you watch one of my other Roth videos, The Paradigm Shift, you'll see that I don't think it matters if you're in a lower tax rate or a higher tax rate when you're retired. The Roth is still superior to pre-tax. Sure, you might end up in a lower tax bracket, but the amount of income that you'll generate out of your retirement plan dwarfs the amount of money that you put into it when you saved and got that tax break up front. But all the income distributions that you'll be taking out, even if they are at a lower rate, the amount of taxes that you'll pay on those distributions would be much higher. But here's another reality that you just can't ignore. In 2023, we have the lowest tax rates in the last 100 years, and we have the worst fiscal balance sheet in the history of our country. The only other time that we're even close to this fiscal situation was after World War II. And you know what happened after that? We had much higher tax rates for decades. In fact, the highest tax bracket got up to 90%, and the lowest bracket was 20%. And most people were paying around 50% in taxes. We have it really easy right now from a tax perspective, but don't assume that that'll last forever. Just look at the recent interest rate changes as an example. When I got into the business in the 1990s, a 9% on your mortgage was normal. Interest rates were driven way down as an attempt to get us out of the recession after Y2K in the early 2000s. And that brought mortgage rates down to historical low levels. I remember when it first crossed below 6%. But then problems emerged with too much debt, and we had to push interest rates up, and that brought us to the financial crisis of 2008. That then drove interest rates back down to even lower lows, and people basically had access to free money. Then we had an unexpected worldwide pandemic, and interest rates got even lower. Now, in 2023, we're dealing with having too much of that free money, and interest rates are going back up to something that is more normal. And if all goes well, they will remain higher for a very long time. But how many people bought into this idea that they could buy a home and have a 2% fixed mortgage rate forever? And now, how many people are living as if they'll be in the 22% tax bracket forever? Or that when they retire, they might fall down to the 12% tax bracket. The big problem is that the government got drunk on free money. They were able to borrow and amass tremendous sums of debt and hardly pay anything more for it. But much of that debt is on short-term rates. And as those loans come due, they have to roll that into new loans at the new current much higher rates. Not only that, but they still have a tremendous deficit, which means that they have to issue more new debt, and all of that new debt is at today's current much higher rates. Let's break it down so that we're all on the same page. There's a few terms that you have to be familiar with. The federal budget, revenues, deficit, debt, GDP, and tax brackets. The federal budget is the amount and categories of where the government will spend their money. The CBO, or Congressional Budget Office, is a wonderful resource and website to find out more information on that. In 2022, the government had expenses of $6.3 trillion. That was their budget. Of that, $4.1 trillion is mandatory, meaning they have really no discretion or ability to cut it. This is mostly healthcare, Social Security, and student loans. $1.7 trillion is discretionary, meaning they can argue where to add or take away. That is broken down into non-defense and defense spending. Typically, that's nearly half and half. However, with COVID, the non-defense side got more of the money. That's likely to change with what's going on currently. and $500 billion went to net interest. That one's a little funny and destined to get much worse. The government borrowed at very low rates, especially after the financial crisis of 2008. So even though the debt grew substantially, the actual payment didn't grow that much at all, staying around $500 billion per year. That is up until last year. Interest rates went up and we had huge deficits. The average interest rate went up to almost 3%, which by simple math puts the payment very close to $1 trillion. The average interest rate on the debt will continue to get higher as new debt gets added and old debt matures and rolls into new higher rates. The government has revenue to cover the budget, or at least a portion of the budget. The largest revenue source is from individual income taxes. Next is Social Security and Medicare taxes. The third highest revenue source is corporate income taxes. In total, the government collected $4.9 trillion of revenue for 2022. And that brings us to the deficit. The deficit is the difference between the government's budget and what they collect in revenue. In 2022, the budget was $6.1 trillion and the revenue was $4.9 trillion. The deficit, therefore, was $1.24 trillion. If you've been paying attention, there's some pretty scary numbers here. Here's an obvious one. Mandatory spending at $4.1 trillion plus the interest on the debt, now pushing $1 trillion, is more than the total revenue in 2022. That leaves nothing left for discretionary spending, including defense. So what happens to all those deficits? They get added onto the national debt, which is now pushing $33.5 trillion. The government does not pay down the principal on the debt. Unlike when you take out a mortgage on your house, you make a payment that includes principal and interest. So the debt is the accumulation of all of our deficits over the last 100 years. But because the government was drunk on low interest rates, 70% of that debt is just what we accumulated over the last 23 years. Yep, it went from 10 trillion in the year 2000 to 33.5 trillion in 2023. It is no coincidence that interest rates went to historical lows after the recession of Y2K. And they stayed at low levels and even got even lower up until the pandemic. And we accumulated $23 trillion of debt during that low interest rate period. But now we're beginning to pay the debt at higher rates. And the party's over. So where does all the money come to support this? GDP, or gross domestic product. It's basically the measurement of what we produce as a nation. The United States is by far the largest economy in the world, with a GDP at about 27 trillion. All the revenue we have to live with, work with, save with, and play with comes from GDP. GDP is used as a measuring stick to gauge our fiscal health. For example, with total government debt at 33 trillion and GDP at 27 trillion, we were at 122% of debt to GDP. That's not a good thing. Historically, we're at around 47% debt to GDP. With revenue at 4.9 trillion, we tax GDP at about 18%. And if we're going to eliminate our deficits and thereby be able to make any kind of headway in the debt, then we're going to have to tax GDP at a much higher rate than that, which means taxpayers will pay much more in taxes. And that brings us to our final term, which is tax brackets. The government plays a balancing act between taxing everybody enough so that it can pay its bills, but not taxing too much that it puts the economy into a recession. With interest rates being so low, they err on the side of not taxing very much. Hence, we currently have the lowest tax brackets since the 1920s. Tax brackets are a tiered taxing system, so that lower income levels are taxed at a lower bracket and higher income levels are taxed at a higher bracket. In other words, the more money you make, the more taxes you pay. There are some nuances here, like what constitutes as taxable income, but that's another discussion in another video. Most Americans have a W-2 income, which means that their income is taxable income. It's my belief that because of these extreme imbalances that we've created with our deficits and our debt, the government will need to tax everybody at a much higher rate than they tax today. And that higher tax rate will continue on for decades. We have trillion-dollar problems, and trillion-dollar problems are not solved quickly. So what can you do about it? Roths, obviously. If you save your money into a Roth, then those future distributions are not taxed. So even if your tax brackets double in the future, you are not paying taxes on that Roth distribution. Here's a really cool thing about saving into a Roth versus pre-tax, is that if everybody did it, then our deficit would be much lower than it is today. Why? Because the government would collect taxes on all of our working income. All the money that people put into their retirement plan pre-tax is not taxed, and therefore increases our deficit by decreasing the amount of income available for the government to collect. So you can be patriotic and set yourself up for one heck of a retirement at the same time. What else can you do about it? Convert some of your pre-tax retirement money into a Roth. More on that in the video Buying Out Your Business Partner. Not only could that be a game changer for your own retirement security, but Roth conversions also help to shrink our current federal deficit. I think taxes are going to be a real problem for people in the future. Some people will do something about it now when the market is still low, hasn't recovered yet, and tax rates are so incredibly low. Some people won't. It's available to everybody equally. It just takes you to learn more about it and take action. Managing money should be a fun and liberating experience. Call us anytime if you have questions or to discuss your own unique financial situation.
Ta-da!